An important Java feature that we're going to use over and over in this course is Java annotations. So it's really critical that if you don't understand Java annotations, that you watch this video very carefully and pay attention to how they work. Throughout the infrastructure in Java that we're going to be using, we're going to see Java annotations spread across that infrastructure. And if you don't understand what annotations are or how they work, it's going to be very difficult to understand the code examples that we're going to be using later on in the course. If you understand Java annotations, you're free to skip this video. I'm sure that you'll be just fine. If you don't feel completely comfortable with them, I think it'd be helpful if you stopped and took some time to watch the entirety of this video. So let's dive into Java annotations. Let's imagine that we are building an application and it has a method to store a video. So we have public void store, and we're going to take some information about that video. Now, we might do something in here, and let's imagine that storing a video is a protected operation. We don't want anybody to be able to store a video. We only want people who are authorized to store a video to be able to do it. So you would imagine we'd like to be able to express to other developers or the framework that's running and encapsulating the store method in its encapsulated object that this is some type of secured method. We'd like a way of expressing that, but Java itself doesn't really give us a way to do that. We could try to name this something like store secured so that others that came and looked at the method would know that this is some type of secured method. But then that sort of relies on a naming scheme. And if there's some other entity that this is incorporated into, it has to do really some complex work with Java reflection to get access to that name and try to decide if it fits the naming scheme, and then we can have different naming schemes. And how do we tell at compile time, for example, if they make a mistake or a typo in their naming scheme? So we need some way of annotating this code with some meaningful expression that we know about that means that it's secure. So what annotations are these little annotations that you see throughout code. And basically, it's an @ sign with a identifier. So this is a simple annotation here that's been created that's saying @secured. It's an additional piece of meta information about this method. And it's simply declared with the @ sign followed by some identifier. There's two interesting things that we can talk about with this secured annotation. One of them is that secured, actually, when it gets created, somebody has to define secured. And the way that that happens is they define an interface called secured that has a special format, and that format signals to Java that that is an annotation that can be applied to some Java element, be it a class or a method or other parts like actual member variables. So we have @secured here, and somewhere else someone has defined a Java file that's called @secure and has an interface in it. And what @secured does, because it's defined in a Java file, it means that if we make a typo here, Java won't recognize the @secured and it will give us a compile error. So we can create naming schemes for our meta information and attach them to various Java elements with these annotations, @secured, and Java will check that it can actually find a declared annotation that matches the naming. And again, we can import the interfaces that define these annotations just like we can import any other Java interface. So somewhere earlier in this class, we could have an import statement that defines where exactly you can find that particular interface defining secured. And then once we've imported it and we have it in our naming space, if we make a typo in it, Java will catch it at compile time. So suddenly we have a naming scheme that can actually be enforced and analyzed by our compiler. The other interesting thing is we may not want our meta information, our names that we're applying to methods like secured, to be applied in the wrong place. For example, @secured may not make sense to apply to a member variable. It only makes sense to methods. And so what Java allows us to do is, in the definition of the interface for @secured, we can specify the type of Java member or element of the source code that we want to apply it to. So we can say @secured only applies to methods. And so if somebody tries to add @secured above a member variable, Java will flag it as a compile error. So it can both check the naming as well as the location that somebody puts one of these annotations. So it's giving us type checking over this meta information that we're defining. We can say, here's a name that's special to us. Here's where we expect it to show up, only on methods. Now, compiler, go and enforce that naming. So we end up with the ability to annotate our code and have the compiler enforce it. The other thing that we can do is we can add parameters that are essentially passed into the annotation you can think of. But really what that means is they're like attributes of the annotation. So for example, we could have an annotation that looked like role equals user. And in this case, role in our interface would be some method that we defined called getRole. So if we define a getRole method in our, if we define a role method in our annotations interface, so the method, the annotation would look something like this for this. It would look like we have an @ interface, secured, we've defined our secured interface, and this is indicating that it's an annotation, and then we would have just a public string role method that's defined in that. And so now suddenly we can go and add the attribute role to our annotation, and Java will check that the value that we provide for role is of the right type. So suddenly we can add attributes and actual type checking of the values that we're providing for the attributes on our annotations. And so this structure of annotations allows us to mark up our code by adding these naming schemes to particular Java elements that the compiler will enforce are in the correct place, as well as adding different attributes to the specific annotations to parameterize them in different ways. And the compiler will not only check that the appropriate attributes are on an annotation, but also that the values for them are correct. So if we define role here, it means that every time somebody goes and defines this annotation, they're going to have the role attribute. So we can go and build these constructs where we have an annotation that we can now apply to specific parts of our code and attach meta information that the compiler checks for us and strongly types. And this is going to be the basis throughout the course of some of the things that we're going to see are the frameworks that we are building on top of. Expect you to go and place these annotations in your code so that the framework can understand what to do with your code.